fields far below us here, the Battle of Stirling Bridge took place centuries ago. Fought between the English forces, led by the Earl of Surrey, John de Warenne, and the Scottish force, a band of men led by our great hero William Wallace. But the battle took place on the 11th day of September, 1297. That's almost 728 years ago. So obviously, I remember it like it was yesterday. Because I was here that day, fighting alongside Wallace. Now, I know what you're thinking, and the answer's moisturiser. And a fair amount of whiskey. Now, on that day, we weren't fighting for honour, or riches, or glory, or anything like that. Instead, we were fighting for something far more valuable. Our very liberty was at stake. Because Scotland had become occupied by the forces of Edward I, King of England. He was also known as Edward the Longshanks. That was because he had long legs. But make no mistake about it, he was a ruthless and an ambitious man, and to understand why he chose to occupy Scotland, you do need to know a little bit of context. You see, just 10 years before this battle, Scotland was at peace. It prospered under the rule of Alexander III, King of Scotland, a wise and noble leader who was well respected by his country. He was also, incidentally, on friendly terms with our neighbours to the south, because Alexander of Scotland married Edward of England's sister, Margaret. So the two kings were brothers-in-law. These good times weren't to last, sadly, as Queen Margaret died, and she was still young. And then the children that she'd had with Alexander sadly also died. First their two young sons, then their daughter, who had married Eric of Norway, also died just after giving birth to a child of her own. The child that she had was known as Margaret, the Maid of Norway. She was now our King Alexander's only surviving relative, his granddaughter. But despite all this personal tragedy, King Alexander had to remarry, to preserve the Scottish royal bloodline. And this time, instead of marrying back into the English court, he chose instead to marry into the French court, and his new bride was Yolanda, Countess of Dreux. Now they set up home at Kinghorn Castle, 40 miles to the east, and just after this wedding, Alexander was called away to Edinburgh to discuss affairs of state with his nobles. Not an uncommon thing, but it meant he had to leave his new bride behind at Kinghorn Castle to make the journey south. It's also worth mentioning, at these meetings King Alexander was renowned for his hospitality. Often there would be wine flowing, and everyone at that meeting was especially excited because they knew that he'd just married a French princess, so they thought the wine would be French this time. And it was! Happy days. Now when the wine was all finished, and the business concluded, Alexander decided he was going to ride back home that very night to get back to his bride at Kinghorn Castle. However, his advisors suggested this maybe wasn't a good plan. It was a wild and stormy night that night, you see, as we sometimes get here in the estuary. And the king had quite a lot of wine. So surely he should wait until the morning rather than riding home in a storm in the dark, drunk. But Alexander would not be reasoned with. He was determined to get home that very night to be back with his bride once more. Perhaps he was just thinking with his heart, not his head. But whatever the reason, he did indeed make that journey that night. The advisors followed the king, but soon he was lost from view. Until that is the following morning when they found his body. Less than 1 mile from his castle, the king's horse had reared up in the storm and thrown its rider, and Alexander had fallen from the cliff tops high above to his death on the rocks below. Now Alexander III was the last of the ancient line of Scots kings, and he died with no sons. The whole nation was in mourning. Scots nobles reached out for advice from Eric of Norway and from Edward of England, and together it was agreed that the best thing to do now would be to send for Alexander's granddaughter. Margaret, the Maid of Norway, had brought back to Scotland after all. She was old enough to be crowned Queen of Scots. Of course, not everyone liked this woman, but Edward of England did because he had a son, and he thought he could marry his son off to this future queen and thereby seize control of Scotland for himself, without even having to conquer it by force. Edward, at this stage in his career, had already conquered Wales and Ireland by force, but now he wanted Scotland as well. However, it wouldn't be so simple for him. On the voyage over from Norway, the young princess got sick, and by the time Margaret's ship had docked at Orkney, she was dead as well. Not much luck in this one. Some said it was just a strange illness. Others suggested something more sinister happened on that boat. Whatever the truth was, it didn't really matter. The result was the same. Scotland needed a new king and fast. back in those days, the rules around situations like this were quite straightforward. If the king died with no heir, then any Scots nobleman who could trace his bloodline back to David I was eligible to become the next king. All they had to do was put their name forward and be considered. So, let's play a game. I'll let you guess. How many Scots nobles do you think will come forward to become the new king? I'll start you off. There's more than one. Any guesses? All of them. Less than all of them, more than 6.
130.
What was that?
20.
Less than 20, but more than 6. Remember that already? 13 is the right answer. A lucky guess. Lucky for you, not lucky for Scotland in this case. 13 men put their name forward. It was chaos. Obviously, they could not agree amongst themselves who the best person was for the job because they all wanted to be the king. But in the end, they did all manage to agree on one thing. All of them agreed that they couldn't agree. So they would need someone else to choose for them. A judge was required to pick the next king of Scotland. This judge would obviously have to be someone wise, someone fair, someone unbiased and impartial who had Scotland's best interests at heart. Who better then to be that judge than Edward, King of England? Now, with hindsight, that seems like an odd decision. But remember that Edward was the dead king's brother-in-law, and seemingly had been a friend to Scotland for 10 years or more. Surely he wasn't going to put his interest before Scotland's interest, was he? Yeah, no, he was actually. That was sort of his job to do that, wasn't it? As King of England. Now, having made his choice, Edward asked all the Scots lords to meet him at Berwick Castle, where he promised them he would reveal all. As in, his choice. He wouldn't do a striptease for them, that would be very inappropriate. Although he did have nice legs. Now, back then, the border was much further south than it is today. Not only was Berwick a Scottish town then, it was also one of the biggest and richest Scottish towns, because it was our main port and trade route to the rest of Europe. So it had a nice big fancy castle, and if you've ever been to Berwick by train, where the station now stands was once the castle. All the Scots lords assembled there. Edward came north to address them. Amongst the 13 men that he could choose from, there were some names that you might recognise. One of the men was called Robert the Bruce, and yet it wasn't the famous Robert the Bruce, it was actually his grandfather. There was also a man amongst the 13 called John Balliol, who everyone agreed was the worst candidate, someone totally unfit to become the king. Would you like to guess who Edward chose? What gave it away indeed? John Balliol. Scots lords were not impressed. They took matters into their own hands. They went behind their new king's back because they suspected this new king was a little better than a puppet for Edward's control. As soon as he was appointed, Edward began making demands. He asked the King John to start paying tax or fealty to the English crown. And if there were any important decisions for the King of Scotland to make, Edward wished to be consulted first to make sure he agreed. And so the Scots lords did indeed go behind this new king's back to form what they called the Council of 12. 12 Scottish nobles who met in secret without telling the king and dealt with Scottish affairs themselves. These men reached out to France to form an alliance between Scotland and France, something we actually still honour to this day. We refer to it as the Auld Alliance, or Long-Term Cordiality in French, and it was a treaty of mutual assistance between Scotland and France at a time when England was at war with France. So it didn't get out well with Edward. He realised he had to fight outside Scotland. And so Edward devised an ingenious test for King John of Scotland. He asked him to provide soldiers, Scotsmen, to fight for England against France. This put King John in a very awkward situation, forcing him to choose between his loyalty to Edward, who'd crowned him king, and his loyalty to his own people, without whom he couldn't rule effectively. When King John decided to do nothing and did not provide the soldiers, he actually gave Edward what he really wanted all along. And that was an excuse to invade Scotland. To make an example of King John for his disobedience, Edward sent an army north to Berwick, the same place he crowned John king. And at Berwick, Edward had his men commit what still stands as the single worst atrocity ever carried out in these islands. Edward's men slaughtered the entire town of Berwick. There were no Scottish soldiers there, just 8,000 civilians, men, women and children. They kept at it till none were alive. It was this act that earned Edward his other nickname, the Hammer of the Scots. Understandably, but this act of barbarism was designed to provoke a response. Edward knew that King John would have no choice. He would have to come south to the army to face him. And that's what happened. Just north hastening defeat for King John, who to no one's surprise was no tactician. In fact, he was easily defeated and then captured. Stripped of his crown, John was sent to live in France in exile for the rest of his life. Then 2,000 Scots lords and nobles knelt down in the mud that day and accepted Edward of England as their liege, lord and king. And Edward wasted no time. He installed magistrates and soldiers in every town and village in Scotland, there to enforce his laws. He left garrisons of soldiers behind in all the larger towns to make sure that these laws were indeed followed, and to raise taxes taken from the Scots who paid to Edward's crown. It was in this way that we essentially became prisoners in our own country for a short time. And all of this was just 1 year before the famous Scottish victory here at Stirling Bridge. Now, that begs the question, what on earth could have happened in that 1 year to so dramatically reverse the fortunes of our nation? To go from being prisoners in our own lands to suddenly victorious here at Stirling? Perhaps you can guess what happened. What gave it away was the... Yes! One man. Two men really, but we'll get to that in a second. 1 year before this battle, no one had heard the name William Wallace before. But after Stirling Bridge, everybody knew who that was. William Wallace had come from a small village called Elderslie in the southwest of Scotland. And as his father's second son, he knew he was never going to inherit lands or titles when his father died, so instead he had to make his own way in the world. But Wallace was content with this. He had spent his childhood learning French, learning Latin, and studying the Bible. Believe it or not, Wallace was training to be a priest. But unlike many training for the priesthood, by the time he was a young man, he'd also gained a bit of a reputation for his temper, having got into trouble several times by then for attacking English soldiers who he thought were persecuting his countrymen. So then, he took it one step further than that. Wallace gathered other like-minded men to his side to fight back. They made their base in the Ettrick Forest, a landscape Wallace knew well. He was to use this knowledge to his advantage. Lying in wait, he and his men would ambush English supply lines that came north through the forest to liberate their weapons for their own use. In fact, the tactics that Wallace used we would these days describe as guerrilla warfare. And he became extremely good at that. So much so he was a real nuisance to the English forces in that area. In fact, in the nearby town of Lanark, the English sheriff, a man called William Heselrigg, had had enough of Wallace to the point that he decided to make a name for himself by capturing or killing them all personally. So when Heselrigg heard news that Wallace would be staying in Lanark one evening at his father-in-law's house, Heselrigg ordered his men to surround that building, to set it on fire, hoping to flush Wallace out, no doubt. The only problem with this plan was that Wallace wasn't actually there. However, his wife was at home. The story goes that when she tried to escape from the fire, Heselrigg ordered his men to throw her back in. Now, if this was designed, Wallace and his men marched from Lanark and surrounded the English garrison. They boarded the soldiers they found there inside their barracks, then returned the favour, setting fire to the building. When they found the sheriff, Wallace dragged Heselrigg all the way through the streets of Lanark, right to the centre of the town. Once there, in front of all the assembled townsfolk watching, Wallace killed the sheriff personally, so that everyone saw him do it, and there'd be no mistake who it was that was responsible. So now, William Wallace was a traitor. He was an outlaw, and he was a murderer, in the eyes of the English forces. And yet to the Scots of the south and west of this country, he'd become something quite different. An inspiration. But he was one of the few people actually fighting back against this invasion. Others then flocked to join his cause. In truth, though, he was not the only one fighting back, because in the north of Scotland, one of the few loyal Scots noblemen was a man called Sir Andrew de Murray. He had also been raising an army to fight back. In fact, he'd been laying siege to garrisons in the north. And it wasn't until these two men met each other, William Wallace coming from the south, Sir Andrew de Murray from the north, to combine their forces at Dundee, where he finally had the makings of a Scots army once more, for the first time since that terrible defeat in Dunbar years earlier. Now, you may wonder why Edward allowed all this to happen, but there's a simple answer to that. During all this time, Edward was in France, overseeing his war against the French, and yet he had heard news of what was happening in Scotland, and it displeased him greatly. That's why he sent one of his generals. The Earl of Surrey, John de Warenne, was to ride north with an army to crush this Scots uprising before the land. We were at Dundee when we heard this news. They were coming for us. advance and very little time. They had to get here to Stirling before them. If we allowed that English army to cross the River Forth here at Stirling, the gateway to the north, then it would all be open. We knew we had no hope of beating them in open combat because there was just far too many of them, far too few of us. We had no horses. So Wallace and the Murray marched us all the way from Dundee to this very spot we are now, top of the very vantage point. From here you can see for miles in every direction, and in the morning of the battle you clearly see the enemy forces as they amassed in the shadows of the camp across the river that way. In fact, if you look that way now, see for yourself. Obviously they weren't there back then. You can use your imagination, they're very nice, aren't they? You can actually see the castle if you go around the side a little bit. Anyway. On that morning it was very clear very quickly just how outnumbered we were. I had never seen so many men gathered. Something else. There was banners, tents, flags everywhere, every shade imaginable. And, as I say, unrelenting Scottish sun beat down as always. Just there. Listening off the walls, metal of their armour and their weapons. It was a daunting sight. And I don't mind telling you that I was afraid before the battle started that day. And yet, I think that Wallace had sensed the crowd amongst us because he came to address us. He told us, all you have to do is hold your position here and wait for my command. That's it. So simple enough. So that's what we did. And as we stood here waiting and watching, the English forces formed their ranks, ready to cross this narrow wooden bridge that led from their side of the river to our one. Now, the bridge itself was only about that wide enough for two horses to fit on it side by side. So we knew the advance would take a long time, but we had plenty of that. As we watched, however, the first ones to cross that bridge from the English side were just two men. Turns out they were clerics. They came on horseback to seek out Wallace personally, to offer him what they described as the king's terms. In other words, a bribe. On behalf of Edward I, Wallace was offered land out in the south, in exchange for which all they wanted him to do was lead us from the battle without fighting. Well, this was just more proof they didn't yet know who Wallace was. Because if they had done, they surely wouldn't have tried this. Wallace just laughed at them. He told them, I did not come here today to talk, nor to be bought. I came here to win back this country's freedom for its people. And though my men are outnumbered, they would prefer to die on their feet, for they will live no longer on their knees. With that, the clerics were sent back to the Earl of Surrey with the message, and the battle would begin. Now, when the advance began, it was the cavalry that came first across the bridge, the English heavy horse, and as they crossed the river, they didn't yet know it, but they were heading into a trap. You see, we knew something that they didn't. Our generals, Wallace and de Murray, had chosen this battleground carefully. They knew that the land on this side of the bridge was a marshland. It was soft, it was boggy ground, and it was totally unsuitable for heavily armoured men and horses, such as the English had on their side. We knew that they would become stuck in such terrain very quickly. In fact, we were counting on it. Now, the English, for their part, they did know that just 2 miles further north from here is a place called Kildene, where there's a shallow ford. They could have chosen to march one more day, to cross at that ford, to outflank our position. And if they'd done that, well, let's just say the result of this battle would have been quite different, and not good for us. So I'm glad they didn't do that. Perhaps it was because the second in command of the English forces that day was Hugo de Cressingham. He was Edward's tax collector and master of coins, and it's thought perhaps he didn't like the idea of the unnecessary expense that another day's marching would cost. Since they obviously had far superior numbers, surely all they had to do was put on a display of power at this bridge, and we would all panic and run away, saving them time and money. Which makes sense, I suppose, but of course, we had other ideas. Now, as they crossed the river, the English cavalry soon realised they were surrounded. Surrounded on 3 sides by the waters of the River Forth. On the last remaining side, Wallace had already sent our spearmen down to close off that loop in the river and make sure that they had nowhere to go. After they crossed the bridge itself, they also found they had to stay on the thin strip of dry ground, the path that led from the bridge to our line. If they tried to go too far left or right from this path, they soon would sink into the much softer mud on either side and become stuck. Watching on, Wallace Wallace let the cavalry cross. There were about 2,000 of them. After they were over, they were then followed by the English infantry. Now, we also let about 2,000 of them cross, enough to make it a fairish thing. They fanned out into that marshland and soon found it very hard going under the weight of their weapons and their armour. When Wallace saw that they were stuck in the mud and in complete disarray, only then did he give us the order to attack, and led his men in a charge down the hillside. And a fearsome sight we made, axes and claymores tearing at them as they drove into the English flank. It was a ferocious assault, so much so they panicked. They broke ranks, they ran back towards the bridge trying to escape, but of course there was no escape for them that way. The route was blocked by their own soldiers coming to their aid. So instead, some turned to the river to slip to safety. Not a great plan. The waters were still within their feet. Any that tried that did not make it to the other side, instead dragged to the bottom by the weight of their own armour and drowned in the boat. The horses were running, bashed against the beach itself, causing the structure to weaken. When Wallace saw this happening, he ordered our archers to fire flaming arrows at the bridge, and we set it ablaze. When the bridge finally fell into the river, with it went any hope the English may have had of taking victory that day. Those that had not yet crossed were now helpless. They could do nothing for their comrades, they could only watch. Those who had crossed, well, they were all doomed to fall or sword blades. In the end, it was a rout, a decisive Scottish victory against an enemy force that had outnumbered us greatly. Yet, of course, it came at a cost. Many Scots fell that day also. When the fighting was done, many more lay wounded. Among the wounded, Sir Andrew de Murray himself, and his wounds were severe. Yet even should he not survive, he would agree. Our sacrifices here that day, they were worth it. Because what we won here at Stirling was not just a battle. We won back our very belief here. This was proof that Edward the Tyrant and his mighty armies could in fact be defeated. Now that we had proved that, we couldn't stop. And every town and every village of the land, and we had one flag of the country screaming for its people. That was after all our purpose. We couldn't stop here. And even though we knew that Edward must return one day, we were also sure that we would do anything he did. Now, after the famous victory here at Stirling, William Wallace and Sir Andrew de Murray were proclaimed as joint guardians of Scotland. They were given the full powers of governance in the absence of our exiled king, King John. Within 2 months of this, Sir Andrew sadly did indeed die from the wounds sustained here at Stirling, and this left Wallace to continue on. You'll have gathered by now that he wasn't really the type to sit back and wait for things to happen. He was a bit more proactive than that, should we say. Wallace began launching raids into the north of England, attacking the same route that any second invasion army would take if they were to return. This, of course, just made Edward more upset. So Edward of England returned from France to lead an army north personally to face Wallace. Hearing this news, Wallace turned his men around and drew the English army further and further north. As he went, he burned the crops and fields behind him to try and make sure that the English would have less to eat and might become demoralised and malnourished. More guerrilla warfare tactics from Wallace. They could not keep this up forever. Finally, his position was discovered near Falkirk to the south of us here, and battle could not be avoided. And so just 10 months after the victory at Stirling, the Battle of Falkirk took place, July 1298. This time the English army led by Edward himself was even bigger than before. And yet the Scottish army was also bigger this time. Because at Stirling we only had 2 Scots nobles on our side, William Wallace and Sir Andrew de Murray. Sir Andrew was obviously gone now. But at Falkirk we had all the other Scots lords and lords pledged to our cause, with all their men behind them as well. So we thought. When the fighting actually started that day, most of them turned and led their men away from the field of battle without taking part, having instead accepted Edward's bribes, taking lands and titles in the south rather than standing alongside Wallace. Wallace and his men did fight at Falkirk, but we lost that day. However, Wallace escaped. He fled to the continent. To seek help for Scotland's cause, Wallace went to the King of France, the King of Norway, to the Vatican. He even went to visit King John in exile in France to beg him to come back. All of it was in vain. Although he met with sympathetic audiences, he did not get the aid he was looking for, and so Wallace returned to Scotland a few years later to fight on. That's when he was finally betrayed. While staying with a man named Wallace's friend, John Monteith, Sheriff of Dumbarton, William Wallace was betrayed and handed over to English soldiers. As a reward for this treachery, John Monteith was given Wallace's sword as a trophy. It stayed there at Dumbarton Castle for centuries afterwards. Wallace meanwhile was taken to London to stand trial in the court of Edward I. The charge against him? Treason. Wallace found ridiculous. How can I be called a traitor? He maintained. When I have always remained loyal to my king. King John Balliol, the Scottish king in exile. But of course, Edward didn't think much of this answer, because he no longer recognised the Scottish crown, having taken it as bad in an effort to ensure no more Scottish kings were ever crowned. And so Wallace was found guilty of treason against Edward's crown, despite never having sworn allegiance to it. And even though he had letters of safe conduct in his person from both the kings of France and Norway, he was sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered. The most gruesome sentence possible, and one usually reserved for the very worst criminals, almost never given to noblemen. But Wallace had angered Edward so much that he wanted to give an example of it. So, on the 23rd day of August 1305, outside the church of St. Bartholomew the Great, West Smithfield, London, this gruesome sentence was indeed carried out. And I'll spare you most of the details, suffice to say that after it was all over, Wallace's head was placed on a spike on London Bridge. The 4 parts of his body were sent to Newcastle, Perth, Berwick, and here, Stirling. Each one of them put on display. A grisly reminder of what happens to those who oppose the tyrannical rule of Edward I. Thankfully, however, within 10 years of his death, that tyranny was successfully challenged, when Edward's son and successor, Edward II, was defeated in the Battle of Bannockburn by Robert the Bruce, 1314, just down the road from us here. Scotland won back its sovereignty for good that day. And that's another story. The moral of this story is very simple. Here it is. Regardless of who you are or where you're from, if you like freedom, and you don't like tyranny or injustice, there's a fair chance that you might resonate with the story of William Wallace. It is a testament to the power of perseverance, faith, adversity, and seeing the insurmountable odds. And it reminds all of us that whatever fate befalls you in this lifetime, if you remain true to your morals and your principles, you can still serve as a shining example for the generations that follow, so that they might surpass your achievements. So I give you Scotland's national hero, William Wallace. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.